actually went through the grieving process last year. I said my goodbyes to Scouts because I didn't think I'd be back, but clearly I can't get enough of you guys. So thank you for making it possible for me to be here today again. So in layman's terms, I know my title's a mouthful. In my PhD, I was really interested in understanding the tight interaction between our hand and our mouth movements. Because humans have an interesting tendency to move their mouth in a similar ways as moving their hands and vice versa. Actually, it was Charles Darwin who first pointed this out in the 1800s, and he said, isn't it interesting how we tend to clench our jaw when we're using a pair of scissors as though our jaw was kind of mimicking what our hands were doing? And how interesting it is when you watch a child sort of draw and how they tend to twist their tongues and make these sort of silly facial grimaces when they're drawing or writing, as though the tongue was sort of mimicking the twists and turns of the hands. And in fact, we also do this during speech. Dr. Ramachandran actually pointed this out. And think about yourself when you say the word go. What do you do with your lips? Well, you protrude them forward. If you were to show me what you do with your hands when you gesture the word go, what do? Quickly. Anyone? Right, you extend your arm forward. What about the word come? What do you do with your lips? You tend to press your lips together. How do you gesture the word come? With your hands. Right, most of us will press our fingers on our palms. So there's this sort of mimicry again that happens between the hands and the mouth. And interesting enough, we see athletes do this all the time, right? You kind of notice that they grunt or they make these, again, silly facial grimaces when they're using their hands like the martial arts over here. And I was really interested in understanding, or basically discovering, whether there was a benefit to these oral facial actions or these speech sounds. Are they actually benefiting your hand movements? So let's get into the science, and let me actually try to prove to you that there is actually an interaction that happens between the hands and the mouth, and this is not just anecdotal. So the first study I'll talk about is a study done by Joëlle Hajj Hand Mouth. It's a pretty neat study, and here they basically show that oral facial actions can in fact affect your hand movements. And it's a pretty simple study. What they have people do here is they have them grab different objects that had different sizes with their mouth. And they ask them to actually keep their hand in a neutral position. So try not to move your hand while you're grasping this object with your mouth. Now, despite being given this instruction to not move the hand, they actually ended up scaling their hand to the size of the object, or I guess basically the size of the mouth. And I'm going to show you the data here. So on the y-axis, you're just looking at the maximal grip aperture, and you can see that the larger the object, the larger the hand grip aperture, even though they weren't grasping anything with their hand. So again, there's this sort of mimicry that was happening between the hands and the mouth. And this study here talks about how speech also can affect your hand movements. And the same group of people actually had participants grasp different objects, but the object was always the same size. And this time around, when they grasped this object, the participant had to either say ah or e at the same time. Now, if you look at the data over here, on the y-axis you have maximal finger aperture, and you can see that when participants said ah, their grip aperture became larger in comparison to when they said e, suggesting that the speech sounds they were making were influencing their hand grip. So why does this happen? What's going on in the brain? One way we can think about this is from an ideomotor perspective, okay? So according to this perspective, the way that we make a movement is you have to think about the effect that you want to produce first, okay? And by virtue of doing that, you can activate responses that have elicited that effect in the past. So for example, let's say you want to say ah. What are the effects of ah? You might be thinking the sound of ah, the way my mouth feels when I say ah. Or we can keep it really simple and say the way your mouth looks when you're saying ah, which is basically opening. So you want to achieve this effect of openness. So your brain says, okay, great. There's multiple ways you can do that. Let me activate the first response that can do that, which is basically opening your mouth. But you can also achieve the effect of openness by opening your hand, which is why when you're saying ah, you're also more likely to simultaneously open your hand and less likely to close your hand, because closing your hand achieves a very different effect of closedness. Now, if we take a step further and we ask, well, what would the reaction time here look like if somebody was opening their hand while saying ah versus closing their hand while saying ah? Well, you would expect a shorter reaction time to somebody opening their hand versus closing their hand, because it's always always easier to initiate a movement that elicits the effect that you're already thinking about. Hopefully that makes sense. So broadly speaking here, I was really interested in understanding what happens to your hand movement reaction time when I force you to think about these effects of these different oral facial actions versus when you're producing that hand movement alone, right? What are these effects actually doing to your hand response? And that's how I was assessing, whether there was a benefit or even a detriment to those hand responses. So if thinking of the effects of the oral facial actions reduced your reaction time relative to when you made that hand movement alone, then I assumed that they were facilitating that hand movement. But if you did the opposite and increased your hand reaction time, then I would assume they were interfering with that hand response. Okay, hopefully you're still following. Okay, so how do I get somebody to think about an effect? I can do it really, really, really simply. And I can just show you the effect, right? Just like I did earlier. I can show you an image of an open mouth, and I force you to essentially think about the effect of openness. So that's what I did in experiment 1. So the first question that I asked is, can images of oral facial postures facilitate and or interfere with hand responses? And according to ID board predictions, presenting the image via presenting the effect via an image should be sufficient at facilitating or interfering with that hand response. And just for the record, I use power and precision grips because that's the most common grips that humans perform. All right, let's go ahead and look at what I did. So I had participants sit in front of a computer screen, and I would show different images of oral facial postures. So this is an example of an image of somebody lip puckering. By somebody, that was me. And so shortly after the image was presented, a cross would appear at the center of the face, and the cross could either be green or it could be blue. Now, if it was green, participants had to initiate a precision grip, which is basically done by depressing a micro switch with your index and your thumb. But if it was blue, they had to depress a separate micro switch by essentially using the 3 remaining fingers to initiate a power grip. And of course, I had a baseline condition. So as you can tell, I removed the mouth. There was no facial features. And this is just to assess what your hand reaction time looks like when it's done on its own. Now, these are the different postures that I showed. But initially, we weren't really sure what to expect because the literature was quite contentious. But this is essentially the assumption. If your hand reaction time was facilitated by these images, then we assume that there was a strong association between that image and that word response. But if it was interfered by that image, then we assumed a weak association. So for my data analysis throughout my whole PhD, I looked at mean delta reaction time, and it might sound daunting, it's really not as complicated as it sounds. All that means is I look at your hand grip reaction time when you look at an image, and I subtract that from your hand grip reaction time of when you don't see any facial features, okay? And if the total is greater than 0, then that would tell me that the images you were looking at were actually interfering with your hand response. But if the total is less than 0, then that would suggest that these images were facilitating your hand response. Okay, let's take a look at my results. Now on the y-axis here, you've got mean delta reaction time, and on the x-axis, you've got the power and precision grips. And as you can see on the left side over here, that an image of somebody lip puckering significantly facilitated a power grip. So people could initiate power grips a lot in a shorter amount of time if they looked at somebody puckering their lips. And on the right side over here, you can see that an image of an open mouth facilitated precision grips. And I know for a lot of the motor control people that might be confusing, so maybe ask me why I think that happened, because I love speculating. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? Question 1 was basically, can images of oral facial postures facilitate or interfere with hand responses? And it seems that presenting the effect via an image was sufficient at facilitating a hand response, which is great. So in experiment 1, I showed the effect through an image. And in a sense, you could say that that was a direct way of showing the effect of an oral facial action. The next question was, what if I kind of do it in a more indirect way by having somebody anticipate the effect instead of actually directly showing it to them? What do I mean by that? How do I do that? Well, I can get you to read something in your head or out loud in the future, and like that, I'm forcing you to anticipate what that mouth or tongue movement would look like without actually directly showing you what it looks like, okay? So that leads me to question number 2, which is, can the covert or over reading of meaningless speech sounds facilitate or interfere with hand grip responses? And according to ideomotor theory, the anticipation of effects should be sufficient at facilitating and interfering with hand responses. So now the question is, what speech sounds do I use? Lucky for me, there was a group in Helsinki that found a very strong association between the syllable T and precision grips and the syllable ka and power grips. And let me tell you what I mean. If you look at their data, when you look at the y-axis, you can see mean reaction time. So not delta, just mean reaction time of the grip response. And on the x-axis, you're looking at precision and power grips. And what you can see is that precision grip reaction time was significantly shorter when participants read the syllable T versus ka out loud. And the opposite was happening for the power grip. You can clearly see that power grip reaction time was significantly shorter when the syllable ka was read out loud versus T. And what's really cool is that a year after this experiment, they had a different set of people do the following experiment that I'll talk about right now. And essentially this time around, they asked participants to just read the syllables in their mind, so silently read it, without saying it out loud. And what was interesting is that silently reading led to a similar trend in the results, right? The same kind of association between the syllables and the grips. So suggesting that you can basically silently read the syllables, and that was enough to result in this effect. So now the question is, maybe some of you are wondering, why is T so closely related to precision grips, and why is ka so closely related to power grips? Well, you gotta think about what's happening in, what you're doing with your tongue, with your mouth, when you are actually saying or producing the sound T. I'm trying not to do it too loud so that I don't have a pop effect. But essentially what's happening here is that you have to place the tip of your tongue behind your upper front teeth, okay? So very, very specific. The tip of your tongue has to go there to make that sound, which is very similar to what you're doing in a precision grip, where you're basically placing the tip of your index on your thumb. So you can say that they share this effect or this feature in common. Now remember when I said earlier that it's always easy to perform two movements together at once if they produce a similar effect. Now, you could say it's a similar idea here for the sound k, which is actually predominantly using the back of your tongue, which is very similar to what you're doing in a power grip, which is basically using mainly the back of your fingers to grasp an object. Okay, so let's look at their data again. When you look at the data, can you actually say that the syllable T is facilitating precision grips and that the syllable ka is interfering with the same grip? Or ka facilitating power grips? Can you actually make this inference of facilitation and interference? And I think the answer is not really, because there's no baseline condition, right? There's no condition where participants actually performed the hand grips on their own without reading anything. And that's obviously what I want to do in my second experiment. And another question that I asked here, because when you think about it, these are two different populations, two different experiments, basically different people in each experiment. So we don't really know if there is a facilitation or interference effect. Is it stronger in the covert or the overt condition? Is there a difference? We don't really know. But ideomotor theory would predict that there wouldn't be a difference between the two conditions. Okay, so for my second experiment, I had 3 different conditions. The first condition was the verbalization condition. And what I did here was I showed the syllable, either T or ka, in black. Okay, so it always appeared in black font at first. Now, when it was in black font, what that meant was that you had to say it in your head, but also get ready to say it out loud. Now, when the syllable color changed, participants had to do 2 things at once. They had to say the syllable out loud and also initiate a corresponding hand grip. So they look like this, T, ka. So we have it at the same time. Now, I had a silent reading condition, and here, when the syllable was in black, all they did was read it in their head. So it was never said out loud. And when the color changed, they simply made a corresponding hand grip. And of course, I had a grip alone condition, so my baseline condition, where I removed, any form of reading, and I just had a square that was in black, and I would change colors, and participants made a corresponding hand grip. And again, over here, same kind of analysis. I looked at mean delta reaction time to infer interference and facilitation. Okay, so let's take a look at my data. Again, on the y-axis, we're looking at mean delta reaction time, and on the x-axis, we're looking at the grips that were made. And the first thing that stands out here is that the syllable T significantly interfered with power grips, which is what we expected. But the syllable ka did not facilitate power grips, which is not what we expected. On the right side, you can see that the syllable ka interfered with precision grips, but the syllable T did not facilitate precision grips. Now you might be wondering, is this the silent reading condition or is this the verbalization condition? It's actually data that's collected collapse between the two because there was actually no difference in the magnitude of the effect, which actually suggests that it's the silent reading, right? It's the covert nature of the task that's leading to this interference effect. So what's the takeaway? If I bring back question number 2, which is can the covert overreading of meaningless speech sounds facilitate or interfere with hand grip responses? And it seems that interference is possible, but we found no evidence for facilitation. And let me tell you, it haunted me. You can ask Luke about that. Okay, so of course here, I really wanted to know why there was no facilitation. And I guess the easiest thing to do is to compare what we did in experiment 1 to experiment 2. And of course there's the obvious difference, which is I used images in one and then there's reading in the other. But there's another difference that I didn't really talk about. In experiment 1, when the color of the cross basically appeared, I gave participants ample time to make that grip response. So a second and a half, okay? Which is ample time in the control. And in experiment 2, I actually, as soon as the syllable color changed, I rushed them to respond, right? So you respond as fast as possible. Now you might be thinking, well, why is that a problem? Well, some models suggest that it is. Now I know you're probably thinking I'm going to get into details about this model. Don't worry, it's not on the exam. You don't have to actually understand it. But really all it means is that sometimes it's better to wait a little bit after the go signal before you respond, because if you do that, you might allow that response activation to keep building up. Now, the analogy for this is that, think about, you have this oven, okay? And you want to bake a cake. And you put in the cake batter when your oven's in pre-heat mode, okay? So the heat's pretty low. And then you start a timer, and you see how long it takes for that cake to bake. Versus placing your cake batter in when the heat is super, super high, it's fully ready. Which cake is going to take less time to bake? Well, the one that you placed when the heat was really, really high. It's kind of the same idea, you know, when I'm talking about response activation. If you wait longer, you know, for that activation to build up, it might take you less time to initiate that response. So my third question is, does that response activation take time to build up? And if it does, then if I give people more time to respond after that color of the syllable changes, then we should see that facilitation and that interference effect together. So for my third experiment, you'll notice I had 2 experiments here, but I'm only going to talk about one because we don't have the time. But basically you'll notice I got rid of the verbalization condition, and I only have silent reading and empirical norm condition, because silent reading was essentially what was leading to the interference, so I didn't really need to include verbalization condition. And the main difference here is when the syllable color changed, participants had 1,500 milliseconds to respond. So they didn't have to respond under high time pressure this time. Okay, so this is what we found. You can see that now for power grips, taking more time to respond, it didn't even matter which syllable they were reading, both of them interfered with power grips. And they weren't really sure what was going on with precision grips, but there was no interference anymore. And this is the point in your PhD when things don't start lining up anymore. It drives you a little bit crazy. So again, the takeaway here is, to go back to my question 3, does response activation take time to build up? My thought process at the time was, if there's no facilitation effect, then maybe that's not what's happening. Okay, so here's something else that we thought about. Maybe we have this really strange oven, okay? That doesn't take time to heat up. Maybe you got this oven that as soon as you turn it on, okay, it is super, super hot, and then it cools down pretty quickly, right? So maybe that buildup is happening really, really early on in time. So it might look something like this. And you might be thinking, well, you already addressed that. You asked people to respond really quickly, so you would have seen if there was an early buildup in activation. That's true. However, remember that there's always a time gap between the presentation of the syllable and the color change, which we'll give a nickname to. We'll call it SOA. Okay? There's always a time gap. So again, to address this and to make sure that people are actually responding when we think that response activation or that heat is super, super high, then we can decrease that SOA. And these are the different SOAs that I ended up using, and we can rush them to respond. So we can make sure or hope that they're responding at a time where that activation is super high, or that heat is very, very, very high. And again, so if this is the case, if that's what's happening, there's a early buildup of activation, then we would expect facilitation and interference to occur under high time pressure and at those short SOAs, and the complete opposite to happen under low time pressure and at the longer SOAs. So So no interference and no facilitation there. So for my last question, which is, does response activation build up early? Again, just to reiterate, if that's the case, then facilitation and interference should be more pronounced at the shorter SOAs and under time pressure. So this is what I did. Again, it's the same exact thing. The only difference now is the display duration of that, or the time between the display of the syllable and the color change. You'll notice this time it's 0, 100, and 400 milliseconds. And what I mean by 0 is that the syllable appeared in its color. It was never in black. It appeared green or in blue. After the color change, participants either responded under time pressure, so 600 milliseconds, or they took their time to respond. Okay, so they had 1500 milliseconds to respond. Okay, so you think, did we find facilitation? We absolutely did not. Okay, so if it was existent, I think it would have been in this condition. So under high time pressure and at 0 milliseconds, that's where we would have expected facilitation to occur. But clearly there's interference, and the longer they took to respond, the worse the interference. Like it got even higher the more interference there was. And actually, if you look at the other SOAs, it was a very similar trend in the results. So just interference all over, and the interference kept building up the longer they took time to make that quick response. Okay, so what's the takeaway? Does response activation build up early? Well, actually, we think it builds up later, and it results in interference. And it might be confusing for some of you to hear this, but I think my data pretty much challenged the idea that the syllable T is actually compatible with precision grips, that the syllable Ka is compatible with power grips, because actually what my data is showing is that they're incompatible. If anything, what we're saying is that perhaps one syllable is like they're both incompatible, but one is maybe more incompatible than the other, right? So again, it speaks to the importance of always including a baseline condition. So just to give you a general summary of experiments 1 to 4, in my first experiment, I showed that when I showed the oral facial effects via an image, so a direct way of doing this, there was facilitation of hand grip responses. But when the effects were anticipated, so with a more indirect method, by reading meaningless speech sounds, we showed that your hand grip responses were interfered. So why do we care? So again, going back to these athletes, a lot of times, like I said earlier, they'll make grunting sounds, they'll make facial expressions, they'll, so for instance, in martial arts, you'll hear someone say kaya while they're, making these hand movements, and the idea is, well, maybe it's actually important to know which sound or which oral facial action is being paired with the hand movement, because sometimes it can lead to facilitation, but sometimes it can also interfere with that hand movement, and that's important to know, especially in a sport where reaction time actually matters. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.